All right. Welcome, everyone. This is our second meeting of the book one of our week on book one of Herodotus. And so we had some professors last week talk a little bit about the context of book one, highlighting some themes and stories. So if you don't mind, we're going to turn it over to you students and find a little bit about how and what you guys talked about in your small groups. Just a reminder, we're talking in the Slack chat room, Common Session 1B. And yeah, we've got some representatives here. And I think I'm going to be a little arbitrary about this. I think Reese is going to go first, and he is representing the Croesus group. So let me turn it over to Reese.
Alrighty. Thank you. So our group, we had a couple of people with a couple different ideas here, just talking about different themes that we saw in book one. I was tasked with writing a 300-word one, so one of the things that I saw personally was the relationship between freedom and slavery that sort of pops up a lot throughout the first book. You can kind of see it, especially with the Ionians and with Croesus himself. When Cyrus asks Croesus for his input on what should be done with the city, Croesus says it would be better for them to be in slavery than it would be for them to all be destroyed. But in other places, you see people fleeing their cities, leaving their homelands rather than be put into slavery. So it's sort of a complex relationship. And we had a few responses to that as well. Let's see, hang on, I'm trying to pull it up here. My computer's just being a little annoying. But let's see. Joyce said that this interaction is very complex, and we were all basically agreeing that it's kind of hard to decipher what Herodotus really thinks about slavery, especially from this first book. She was saying that it seems sort of par for the course, for people to be enslaved and they were conquered. But it's, like I said, it's difficult to tell if Herodotus thinks that this is natural and acceptable, or if it's something that should be avoided, and if he's praising the people who avoided it. And some of that might also have to do with, as Joyce was saying, the people who, like Herodotus puts trying to articulate this well, Herodotus puts a big emphasis on the lineage of people. And so when somebody like Croesus or Cyrus, when they have a lot of power like this, it sort of seems like the natural thing that should happen. And we're not sure if that's the case for the people who are not rulers like that as well. And a few more people agreed basically with that sentiment. And then we also had the only other subject that we really covered was sort of proposed by Nathan in our group, and he was mostly, let me see if I can get out of this so that I can find that quote. He was mostly saying that there's a pattern to the way that Herodotus writes the histories that you can kind of see in book one. He'll start with an important character and sort of trace his way back through to the people who sort of started that. And, he qualifies his knowledge a lot with saying, as far as I know, or these things I know to be existing in my day, or saying he hears these things from hearsay. He's very, very deliberate in the way that he tells these stories about these people who sort of came before him, but who he finds really important. And like I said, that's sort of a pattern that you can kind of see happening throughout the throughout book one. Let's see, hang on. There's one comment here that was added recently that I haven't had the chance to read yet, but basically it says the authority and the credibility of his account seems to be the establishment of his relationship to the event itself, which I think is a very interesting insight. He says, you know, as he traces the distance between himself and the events he describes through the people, if not himself, who actually observed it and passed it on to the story. And while this may have been a valid basis for ascribing textual authority in 5th century Greece, I think that any work that attempts to accurately communicate historical events must necessarily present material evidence to back up the assertions made by oral accounts. And that's just me quoting Aaron Woodall. So that's about everything that we covered. That's basically the gist of what the Croesus group talked about this weekend.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Reese. So yeah, that some of those things came up in the other groups too, and we'll hear more about that. A lot of interest in the pattern of how Herodotus presents information, and that freedom slavery thing. Keep an eye on that for the rest of your reading. All right. How about Elizabeth with the diocese group? Elizabeth, what did your group talk about today, or this week? Sorry.
So overall, our group seemed to be interested in how he retold or told stories that were would have already been known, especially the story of Gyges, and then Candalis and his wife. So originally, the conversation began with the question of, one of the questions that I asked was, do you think that he wrote his own accounts of the kings and cities because he wanted to put his own 2 cents in, or more because he wanted to get the closest witnesses to these events that he could, and so provide like the most accurate retelling? So there were like a lot of really good thoughts that came out of that conversation. Let's see, so one person, trying to find like all the different ideas. So, sorry. So one person said, as I have read through the first book written by Herodotus, I have gotten the feeling that he is not rewriting these stories completely, but rather creating a compilation of stories that he has both heard or that he has read. So that was like one idea, that he's kind of just gathering information that's already there for him and kind of formatting it so people can study them more in, with the details that he adds in. And then especially the detail that Dr. Wadden brought up in his discussion was that the quote from the book, this Candalis fell in love with his own wife. It really like stuck out to a lot of us because he just kind of slides that in there, and it gives you a lot of idea into a lot of thoughts like into why Herodotus adds that, or why he's writing this story that other people have already known. And then one other person thought that it kind of, I forget exactly what they said, but that it's almost like a tabloid, like he's trying to add in a lot of details so people will, you know, be really interested and fascinated. And that's kind of an interesting thought too, that, you know, he wasn't writing it so much to inform, but more to like captivate the readers. So, so overall, it was more a question of why he's writing these things that people might already have heard of and adding more detail. So that's kind of
excellent. Thank you, Elizabeth. So good things that that idea of thinking about the nature of the storytelling. You'll continue to explore that, and other groups did that too. Do we have a representative of the Cyrus group in the Hangout? I don't think we did. I do have a particular order to this. It's not totally arbitrary, but so Croesus, Diocles, Cyrus, Astyages, Cambyses, and Harpagus, that's the order that they appeared in book 1, just FYI. So that's not entirely arbitrary, and no judgment about who was a worse person and how that fits with your group or whatever, worse leader. That's just good names to start groups. How about the Astyages group? Anyone representing them? I don't know if we had anyone. But Zach, you were up for Cambyses. So Zach, what did you all talk about this week?
Okay, so the different prompts that we were given to write about was either what we found that made it like kind of hard to focus on makes it kind of hard to focus on Herodotus himself. Give me 1 second. I'm gonna leave the room because I'm hearing myself talk over on the other side and I can't focus. I'm really sorry. Give me 1 second.
No worries, Zach. We'd rather hear what you have to say. And yeah, there can be feedback with the YouTube. So.
Okay.
All good. I know I was.
So the 2 prompts that we had to talk about was what did we find difficult about the text, like to like really submerge ourselves into the text, what we found difficult to like really get into it, and then different things that Herodotus would account for evidence-wise, like what he would say, oh, this makes sense, this happened, so this has to happen, like this makes sense. Different things on that, like was it effective, is it biased in any way? So, and then our first response, they went in to talk about how Herodotus uses like genealogy and their past ancestry to kind of define who people are as a person now, which they used an example, George Washington. They said like we don't look at George Washington's great-great-grandfather to depict how he is, like to predict that he was going to have fortune and have success, which like, I mean, it makes sense. And they use the example of Croesus and how they Herodotus traces back to his ancestor of the Gyges and to gain the kingship of Lydia and that entire story. So that makes sense. And then the next person talked about what was difficult for them, and they talked about, and I'm pretty sure every single group has talked about this, was all the different little stories that Herodotus will really go off on, like as he's talking, and then he'll just talk about something else, and it seems like out of nowhere. But then when you really look down, like it does make sense why he's giving all these little backstories, because since there's no other form of like history or information telling, having all those different stories does help kind of build a solid foundation. But because what we're used to now, that's just so different, so it seems so weird to us, but it kind of makes it hard. Nevertheless, it makes it hard to read because that's obviously not what we're used to. The next was the lack of hard proof and concrete facts, which went along with the prompt too as well, like not having what makes it hard to really digest things that Herodotus says, since he uses a lot of word of mouth and oh, this happened, like, oh, okay, I just have to believe you because I have no way to check everything. And since we live in such a technological age and world now where we can fact check everything, we can check things, it just makes it kind of weird, I guess, is what they were going for. And I can totally understand why that kind of bothers them, because we can check everything now, and if someone's lying, we can check to see that. But since Herodotus is kind of the first account and there's not too many other like things to fact check him on, everything he says we either have to believe or not believe based on does it sound believable, as opposed to being able to actually look and see, oh yes, this is true or not. And then the last thing that was talked about, that was actually my prompt that I used. I responded to prompt 2 as well. So what makes it what makes it like hard? Like what does he use that makes it hard to kind of believe him? And I talked a little bit about the oracles and how they really kind of use the oracles a lot to if you look at the way he talks about the oracles in some passages, like he just talks about them so highly and stuff. And so it's just kind of weird having to go off of those. And I know someone commented back on me because I had forgotten about some passages where they do talk about how they don't listen to the oracles. So they kind of came back and said, well, you're not entirely right. So, I mean, but yeah, so I think for the most part, everyone was really working off each other, and I thought it was a really cool group discussion and everything. So.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Zach. Yeah, there is a lag between the YouTube and the Hangout, so it's good to separate just to prevent feedback that then makes it hard to hear what the great things that you're saying. This issue of sources and fact checking came up in a lot of the groups. It was good to read that and keep watching for that. It's a good way to compare, like Zach said, how we deal with sources today versus how Herodotus did. Good way to bring it back to the modern world. Let's see, Joanna, do you want to tell us a little bit about the Harpagus group? I think Joanna has to step out, so just give her a minute so that it doesn't cause a delay, and we don't want to miss what she has to say. All right.
Okay, I'm sorry about that. Okay, so we talked about the way Herodotus, a lot of our discussion revolved around the fact that he used telling his stories and how he questions. And so one of our topics, how when he goes into his digressions, he goes, and so that's the story of so-and-so, and how he kind of breaks it up so you can tell what's the main story versus what's the digression or what's the explanation that he talked about. We also talked about how the interactions between the characters and the gods bring up questions concerning the characters trusting the gods and the gods' accuracy in their prophecies. So Herodotus is obviously kind of satirical when it comes to what he believes, I guess, and the way he describes the oracles and the way he describes the gods. And so Helen brings up really that Herodotus doesn't believe every oracle, and that he says that the oracles could have a bias, you know, that they know what's going to happen, but how do we really know what they know what's going to happen? Specifically with the story of Croesus, when he continues to go back and forth between the Oracle of Delphi and what he's going to do, if he's going to wage war or not, they, at the end, give him this prophecy that ends up saying that he's going to, well, he doesn't know that it's the time, and so he wages this war against the Persians, and then he ends up destroying his own kingdom in the process. So, and their response to that was that he should have had them explain their prophecy, or had their prophecy, what's the word I'm looking for? It's explained or kind of looked at and told in a way, or that would make more sense to him. I think that Herodotus Herodotus at that point is you can really kind of get a sense of how he really believes that the gods are not there. I guess is in his opinion is that he believes that some people are so bound to what the gods say that that's all they can think about, and that's all. So they go to these oracles to figure out whether they should make a decision or not, and then come back and make that decision, but that doesn't always turn out the best for them. And so it seems to me like he's very crippled, or they are very crippled by what the gods and the oracles are telling them to do. This is a writing style of Herodotus. Let me find the post. So he brought up a really good example. So like I said before, when he deviates from the main plot in order to recount another tale, he always says, and this is the story of so-and-so, to end or begin that kind of digression. And so she compared him to a narrator of a play, and that he's basically just telling us a story and tale by making it more interesting by having all these digressions people are and how they act, they do, how they worship their gods. And so she says that seriously refers to the history of his account, a declaration of ownership that she thinks indicates to some degree that the book is a piece of art rather than a piece of history, like we tend to view it today. It's kind of interesting to look at it from a standpoint of this play could have been a play meant to be presented to a people rather than something for us to read and take literally. And I think you can kind of see that within all of his stories about the gods and stories about, him including myths like Arion and the dolphin. So that's kind of what we talked about. So.
Great, thank you, Joanna. Yeah, so that question of storytelling, like I said, that came up quite a few times. We can talk about literacy as we go through too. The idea that most people, we think, would have listened to this if they heard it at all. I guess not a lot of written books, right? In Herodotus' own time. So something to think about. We have a couple more people in the Google Hangout, and I want to invite Grant. Did you have anything you'd like to say? I know he didn't want to be on camera, but wanted to give him the opportunity to talk if he wanted to. Grant, anything to add?
It's not so much that I didn't want to be on camera,
Okay.
or that it would kind of delay my computer.
Right, that's quite all right too. We're happy to hear from you, even if we can't see you.
And
Thoughts you'd like to add? You're from Croesus, right?
I think so. Yes.
Okay.
Unfortunately, this is my first chat.
All right.
Yes, I'll just say glad to be here. Glad to hear different opinions. And I'm sorry if I don't have much to put in this time, just because I'm not prepared to speak.
That's okay. We're just glad to hear a student voice and have you participate. So thank you very much, Grant. And keep joining. Go ahead.
As to what I saw in the chat about the Plutarch calling Herodotus the father of lies because of the potential historical inaccuracies. One of the ideas that I was having was possibly that Plutarch kind of hasn't really lived in an age where historical accuracy has been this is an incomplete idea, just so you know. He hasn't really lived in an age where people have widely distributed stories that have been considered pure fact. A lot of the stories that would go around were indeed interpretations, and people often would decide which interpretation they felt was better, and perhaps one of the things that helped separate Herodotus from many of the other writers would be that he had a more overarching narrative to his seemingly unconnected stories. So basically, I'm kind of saying that perhaps as a writer, he was someone who kind of had to indulge in both ends of the spectrum, fact and fiction, in order to fully realize his ideas. That's about it.
Okay, thank you, Grant, for sharing. Yeah, and that's something to keep in mind too. This question of factual accuracy. Book 1 is a sort of an ancient history of the Persian War, and as we get closer to events that are actually happening in Herodotus's time, does that question of accuracy and source material, does that change as we get closer to what could be considered contemporary events for Herodotus? Just watch for that. And we also have the students from Southwestern in our hangout, so I just wanted to see if they wanted to add anything.
Yeah, sure. I am in the Croesus group, and we did talk a little bit about power in that group. I just think it's interesting. We talked about how a lot of these stories that Herodotus tells, that we can point to the inaccuracies or the factual inaccuracies of, are often to explain political instances, whether that be a change of power, the victory of one state over another, or even the propensity to rule, or the propensity to take authority. So we talked a little bit about where power comes from, whether that be through lineage or winning wars. So I think it's interesting to take into account Herodotus, considering that perspective as well, that he may be utilizing these stories or taking into account these stories because of the political significance that they have as well.
All right, good. Anyone else? No one else wants to throw in?
It's really hard to top that.
All right. Fair enough. Okay. Well, continue to discuss in your small groups. A lot of these themes are going to continue to appear as I've mentioned tonight. So we can keep the chat going, and then on Thursday, we'll hear a little bit about book 2. So moving forward a little bit, this book is famous for having a long sort of digression on the Egyptians. So that will be very interesting. So we'll keep moving. If you want to, it's a good idea to start reading book 2. Try to skim through it and don't get bogged down in all the names and everything. Just try to get some of these thematic pieces that you guys are doing great work with. Okay. All right. Big thank you to all of our participants. Everybody wave goodbye as we sign off here. Thank you so much for being on camera. All right. Everybody have a good night.